Belgium, December 1944. The snow fell without mercy, covering everything: trees, roads, wrecks. The Ardennes had become a graveyard of steel. Somewhere outside Bastogne, a Sherman tank sat silent in a frozen ditch. Its turret was jammed at an awkward angle, its engine dead, its crew huddled nearby for warmth. The transmission had seized 3 days earlier. Command had marked it as abandoned. Sergeant Earl McAllister arrived in a half-track full of tools, cigarette clenched between his teeth, eyes tired but sharp. He was the division's best mechanic, the kind who could make an engine run out of scrap metal in spite. He walked around the dead tank, kicked the frozen tread, and muttered, "You don't die on me, not out here." His assistant, Private Knowles, checked the report clipboard. "They said she's finished, Sarge. Gearbox cracked. We're supposed to strip her and move on." McAllister lit another cigarette from the old one. "I don't scrap machines. I resurrect them." They pried open the engine hatch. Steam hissed out. The oil was sludge, the fan belts brittle, the clutch plate frozen solid. It was the same failure that had killed a dozen tanks that week. A flaw the manuals said couldn't be fixed in the field. Command's order was simple: abandon, replace later. But McAllister had spent years fixing tractors in winter fields back in Kansas. He knew metal could be convinced to live again, if you were willing to ignore every rule. He told Knowles, "Find me a fan off that wrecked Panther down the road." "Sir, that's German hardware." "Good. Maybe it'll hate them enough to work for us." They worked in the cold until their hands bled, torch flames sputtering in the wind. McAllister unbolted, rewired, welded, cursed. Snow melted on hot steel and turned to steam. When dawn came, the tank's engine coughed once, then again. The fan whirred. Gauges flickered to life. The crew stared as their dead machine began to rumble. McAllister climbed onto the hull, slapped the armor twice, and said, "She's breathing." He didn't know it yet, but that single act of defiance, an illegal fix born in the snow, would turn this crippled Sherman into the fastest tank in Europe. Everyone thought the Sherman tank was predictable. Every bolt, every lever, every gauge, the same in every division from Normandy to the Rhine. The manuals said it, the officers believed it, and the factories promised it. Standardization was strength. But to the men who drove them, that sameness was a curse. The Sherman's biggest weakness wasn't its armor or gun, it was its refusal to change. Factory rules forbade modification. Field mechanics were ordered to replace, not redesign. In a world where German tanks evolved mid-battle, American machines were told to stay obedient. That obedience killed speed. By 1944, the M4 Sherman was reliable but sluggish. In summer mud or winter frost, its transmission struggled. The official maximum road speed was 25 miles per hour, but in combat conditions, most couldn't push beyond 15. Crews joked that their tanks had 3 speeds: slow, slower, and stop. But McAllister didn't laugh. He'd spent his life fixing machines that shouldn't work: farm trucks without brakes, harvesters built from spare parts. To him, a dead Sherman wasn't a problem. It was an insult. He saw what the engineers in Detroit couldn't, that each tank was more potential than product. "Every one of these girls is different," he told his crew. "You just have to listen to what she needs." The Army didn't want mechanics to listen. They wanted them to follow diagrams. But war isn't a diagram, it's a deadline. McAllister's division called him reckless. Headquarters called him dangerous. But the soldiers whose tanks he fixed called him something else: a miracle worker. He saw the machine as a living thing. It could breathe, overheat, choke, recover. Its failures weren't permanent, only misunderstood. And while officers demanded uniformity, McAllister believed the opposite. He once said, "If every tank's the same, every failure's the same. That's not strength. That's stupidity." The Army thought they were building one kind of tank. McAllister was about to prove there were two: the ones that followed the rules and the ones that won the war. The myth of the identical Sherman would end with the growl of an engine that wasn't supposed to run, and the hands of one mechanic who refused to let it die slow. The Sherman's heart was a masterpiece of compromise. A Ford GAA V8, 500 horsepower, born from aircraft design, strong enough to move 30 tons of steel, but fragile when it came to temperature and torque. It wasn't built for the cold and certainly not for the chaos of the Ardennes. The design worked fine on paper. In field conditions, it betrayed its own brilliance. The transmission sat tight against the engine compartment, sealed to protect it from dust, but that also trapped heat. As the oil thickened in freezing air, the gears labored harder, friction built, and temperatures spiked past safe limits within minutes. At 260 degrees Fahrenheit, the clutch plate would warp. At 280, it fused. Once that happened, the tank stopped. And it wasn't restarting without a replacement gearbox, which could take days to arrive. The Army's technical manual, TM9731A, had one simple instruction for winter conditions. Do not exceed 20 miles per hour. Do not alter fan housing or air intake. To a desk engineer, that was caution. To a field mechanic, that was suicide. By the winter of 1944, ordnance teams were losing more Shermans to freezing and overheating than to enemy fire. The 2nd Armored Division logged 30 mechanical immobilizations per week during December alone. Most were caused by clogged fans and oil starvation. McAllister read every report. He circled the same phrase again and again. Unable to repair in field. He didn't believe it. In the wrecking yard behind his depot, he began collecting dead parts. Fans from half-tracks, radiators from trucks, even the intake system of a crashed P-47 fighter. He tested airflow patterns using cigarette smoke, watching how the heat moved through the compartment. That's when he saw it. The problem wasn't cooling. It was direction. The air circulated inside the housing but never escaped. The system was choking itself. He drew a diagram on the back of a map. Redirect airflow from the side instead of the rear. Widen intake space. Swap the fan for a broader pitch. It violated every maintenance order ever written. But it could work. One night, Knowles found him hunched over the engine of a wrecked Sherman, welding by lantern light. "You know that's illegal, right?" McAllister grinned without looking up. "So's dying for bad design." When the prototype engine fired up, the temperature stayed low. The airflow doubled. The oil stayed thick enough to grip. For the first time in months, a Sherman ran clean through the cold. It wasn't a miracle. It was math done by a man who refused to freeze. The numbers told a story colder than the Ardennes itself. By December 1944, 1 out of every 6 Shermans in Northern Europe was immobilized by mechanical failure. Not by enemy action, not by mines, but by its own heart seizing in the cold. Half of those breakdowns were traced to the same cause: oil thickening and fan inefficiency. Each repair required 12 man-hours on average. Each replacement gearbox weighed on 200 pounds, shipped from depots hundreds of miles away. Every stranded tank required a wrecker, a tow cable, and 2 other vehicles for escort. Every immobilization turned into a small logistical crisis. The cost wasn't measured in money. It was in movement. Every stopped Sherman blocked a road. Every blocked road delayed an advance. McAllister once joked bitterly, "We're not fighting Germans. We're fighting gravity." The numbers confirmed it. A single disabled tank could reduce convoy efficiency by 30%. Entire armored columns were crawling through Belgium at 5 miles per hour, slower than infantry. And while U.S. generals demanded speed, the machines were slowing to a crawl. Fuel burned faster than progress. Tanks idled just to keep warm, wasting gallons of gasoline that never reached the front. German divisions learned to exploit it. They waited for the mechanical pauses, the moments when the engines stopped roaring and only silence filled the snow. That's when the artillery came. McAllister's team logged every failure they could find. They built charts, patterns, predictions. In one notebook, McAllister wrote, If we keep freezing every 20 miles, the war will outlast the winter. He began running his own numbers. The gearbox temperature rose 4 degrees every minute under full throttle. The fan reduced heat by only half that rate. It wasn't physics. It was slow suicide. He sketched an equation in grease on the tank's armor plate. Heat. Airflow equals death. Airflow. Heat equals motion. To the Army, it was scribbles. To him, it was prophecy. He calculated that if the cooling flow could increase by even 25%, the tank could maintain top speed indefinitely, 30 to 35 miles per hour on firm ground. That was faster than any tank in Europe, German or Allied. It wasn't impossible. It was forbidden. So when McAllister decided to act, it wasn't out of arrogance. It was simple arithmetic. Every hour lost to regulation meant another frozen crew, another dead machine, another battle fought at half the speed it should have been. If the Army couldn't fix it, he would. And if that meant breaking the rules, then the rules were the real problem. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was still brutal. The air bit at bare metal, turning every wrench into ice. Inside a ruined barn near Namur, Sergeant Earl Mac McAllister and his crew worked in silence under a canvas tarp to hide the light from German patrols. The Sherman sat gutted, its transmission pulled open, hoses hanging like veins. Around it, piles of scavenged parts, a P-47 radiator, a Jeep's oil filter, a Panther cooling fan. Private Knowles stood by, shaking his head. "Sir, this looks like a junkyard threw up." McAllister smirked. "Good. Junk runs better when it's scared." He welded until sparks lit the dark. They rewired oil lines, widened the intake vents, and bolted the captured German fan into a new housing he'd cut himself with a hacksaw. Every part came from something that wasn't supposed to fit, but McAllister didn't care what the manual said. When he finished, the engine compartment looked like a Frankenstein of American grit and German engineering. He leaned back, wiping his hands on a rag blackened by oil. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're looking at the first Sherman that might actually enjoy winter." They fueled it carefully, priming the carburetor. McAllister climbed into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and nothing happened. Silence. Then a cough, a sputter, a roar. The modified fan shrieked like a jet. Air blasted through the new vents, scattering snow. Gauges that once spiked red stayed steady and cool. The crew whooped in disbelief. "Temperature?" McAllister shouted. "Climbing slow. 50 below danger mark," Knowles yelled. McAllister slammed the hatch shut and grinned. "Then let's see what she's got." He drove the tank out into the open field, treads crunching over ice. The rebuilt transmission responded instantly. The engine didn't just run, it sang. 20 miles per hour, 25, 30. The snow sprayed behind them like a rooster tail. "Sir, we're going to throw a track," Knowles yelled over the headset. "Then we'll pick it up and keep going," McAllister replied. The tank hit 34 miles per hour, faster than any Sherman had ever moved off-road. The crew was laughing now, exhilarated, alive. When they stopped, steam hissed softly from the exhaust. The engine idled, smooth, calm, obedient. McAllister climbed down, patted the armor, and said quietly, "Welcome back, girl." They named her Hotfoot. By morning, word had spread through the division. A tank the brass had ordered scrapped was now leading convoys. Mechanics came from other units just to see it. "Impossible," one officer muttered. "You can't mix parts like that." McAllister only shrugged. "Tell her that." When the colonel finally saw the speed reports, he stared in silence. "Who authorized this?" McAllister answered without hesitation. "Nobody, sir. That's why it works." Hotfoot rolled out again the next day. And this time she wasn't alone. Other crews had already started copying the fix. One illegal resurrection had become the blueprint for a revolution in motion. By January 1945, the division's maintenance records began to look like science fiction. Breakdowns were dropping. Convoys were arriving ahead of schedule. Fuel reports showed tanks burning cleaner, running cooler, and covering almost twice the daily distance. Nobody could explain it, at least not officially. Headquarters assumed it was luck, but in the workshops, every mechanic knew the truth. Hotfoot had started an epidemic. McAllister's fix spread like wildfire. Crews scavenged fan blades from wrecked panzers, cut extra vents into their hulls, and rerouted exhausts with fuel drums. Some even welded on aircraft parts from shot-down fighters. There were no blueprints, just whispers, measurements, and rumor. The McAllister mod, as soldiers called it, traveled faster than the paperwork meant to stop it. Within a month, over 500 Shermans across 3 armored divisions had adopted some version of his illegal design. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was changing the pace of war. The numbers told the truth before the officers did. Average mechanical downtime dropped by 47%. Transmission failures were cut nearly in half. Fuel efficiency rose by 22%. Entire armored columns began to move differently. Smoother, faster, more aggressive. Logistics officers recalculated marching speeds and couldn't believe the results. One report simply read, "Tanks arriving faster than scheduled, drivers possibly reckless." They weren't reckless, they were liberated. McAllister's invention didn't just make machines faster, it made men bolder. They stopped fearing breakdowns. They started chasing the fight. German scouts noticed the change too. One Wehrmacht report intercepted by U.S. intelligence described enemy armor advancing with impossible velocity, even over snow and mud. Back at headquarters, an ordnance officer finally connected the dots. He sent McAllister an official order to cease unauthorized modification pending review. McAllister sent back a single-line reply. "Review's over. She's moving." By then, the math of disobedience had already won. The new Shermans weren't just surviving. They were rewriting the tempo of the front. Every illegal bolt tightened, every fan replaced, every rule broken shaved hours off the war. The Army had built standard tanks. The soldiers had built unstoppable ones. February 1945. Operation Grenade. The race to the Rhine. The 2nd Armored Division was ordered to advance through the flooded plains of western Germany. The terrain was a nightmare. Frozen mud, cratered roads, shattered bridges. Every calculation said the armor would move at a crawl. But the calculations didn't include Hotfoot. McAllister's tank led the column, fan blades whining like a jet engine purring smooth despite the cold. The field was slick with meltwater, but the treads bit deep and held. At first light, German artillery opened fire from the far ridge. The Shermans should have stopped to return fire, but McAllister didn't stop anymore. He shouted into the radio, "Full throttle, don't think, just drive." The tanks surged forward. Their modified cooling system screamed under the strain, air howling through widened vents. The entire formation moved like a living thing, 30 tons of steel per vehicle, cutting through the mire at nearly 30 miles per hour. The Germans didn't understand what they were seeing. Their guns tracked too slowly. By the time they adjusted, the Americans had already closed the distance. McAllister's driver, Corporal Hayes, yelled over the intercom, "Sir, we're redlining the engine." McAllister grinned through his headset. "Good. Let her sing." They reached the ridge faster than any armored unit had in the entire campaign. Shermans rolled up firing on the move, something the manual said was impossible on soft ground. The 1st Panther didn't even have time to rotate its turret. Within 20 minutes, the German defensive line collapsed. A stunned American colonel watching through binoculars radioed headquarters. "Our armor is moving at light speed. What the hell did they do to those tanks?" No one answered, because no one in command truly knew. By nightfall, McAllister's company had advanced nearly 50 miles, seizing 2 bridges before German demolition teams could destroy them. It was the fastest armored advance on that front since the war began. In the after-action report, one officer wrote, "Enemy resistance moderate, Terrain unfavorable. Progress inexplicable. To McAllister, it wasn't inexplicable. It was airflow and grit. It was the sound of mechanics who refused to freeze, of rules rewritten in real time. When they finally stopped for refueling, McAllister climbed down, his face streaked with oil, his hands trembling from cold and adrenaline. He leaned against Hotfoot's hull, listening to the rhythmic hum of the fan he'd stolen months earlier. "Not bad for a pile of junk," he muttered. Hayes laughed. "Junk that outran the war, sir." And that night in the fields near the Rhine, surrounded by exhausted men and living machines, Sergeant Earl McAllister realized something simple. He hadn't just built a faster tank. He'd built momentum itself. The letter came 3 days after the Rhine crossing. It bore a red stamp. Ordnance Inspection, Priority. Sergeant Earl Mac McAllister was ordered to report with his tank to the Field Evaluation Depot outside Cologne. No explanation, no congratulations, just a summons. When he arrived, the place was crawling with engineers, clipboards, cameras, stopwatches. Rows of identical Shermans stood silent in the mud, their hoods open like dissected beasts. His tank, Hotfoot, stood out instantly. Extra vents, scavenged fan housing, uneven welds. It looked like a factory's nightmare. A young ordnance officer with polished boots circled the tank, frowning. "You're the one who's been modifying Army property?" McAllister nodded. "Fixing it, sir." The officer glanced at his notes. "The regulation says—" "I know what the regulation says," McAllister cut in. "And it doesn't move 30 tons through snow." A murmur rippled through the group. One of the senior engineers, a colonel with grease under his fingernails, raised a hand. "Enough talk. Show us what this thing can do." They cleared the yard. Cameras rolled. The crew climbed aboard. McAllister signaled the ignition. The engine turned once, then roared alive, smooth and deep. The fans screamed, air blasting through the side vents like a hurricane. Gauges held steady. Exhaust burned blue. The colonel leaned into his stopwatch. "All right, Sergeant. Take her out." McAllister pushed the throttle. Hotfoot lunged forward, tracks tearing through the dirt track, accelerating faster than any Sherman the inspectors had ever seen. 15 miles per hour. 20, 30, 34. At full sprint, the tank looked alive, breathing, growling, unstoppable. When it skidded to a halt, the engine still idled cool. No smoke, no burn, no heat haze. The colonel stared at the temperature gauge, jaw slack. "You're running 40 degrees cooler than baseline." McAllister grinned. "Told you she likes the cold." The officer with the clipboard spoke again, this time quieter. "You realize this violates every technical order we've issued since '42? McAllister shrugged. "Then maybe the orders are wrong." Silence. Then the colonel chuckled. Just once, then louder. "He's right," he said. "Damn thing works." The inspection report later described it in bureaucratic language. Experimental field adaptation demonstrating superior efficiency. Recommend inclusion in future designs. Unofficially, everyone called it the McAllister fan system. The U.S. Army would never admit it came from a field mechanic scavenging parts off a German tank. But the data was undeniable. Within months, the cooling redesign appeared in prototypes for the new M4A3 E8 EZ8. When McAllister left the depot, an engineer shook his hand and said, "You just made history, Sergeant." He smiled faintly. "No, I just made her run right." When the war ended, medals went to generals and ribbons went to heroes. But somewhere in the ruins of Cologne, a single tank sat cooling quietly. A machine that had proven rebellion could move faster than regulation. Sergeant Earl Mac McAllister never saw himself as an innovator. He didn't write reports or submit blueprints. He just hated seeing good machines die slow deaths. But history would later realize what he'd done. His illegal fix, the hybrid cooling system patched from scraps, had become the unseen ancestor of the Army's next generation of tanks, the M4A3E8. EZ-8, with its new engine layout and airflow design, bore the fingerprints of a man who'd never worn an engineer's badge. To the world, the Sherman's evolution looked like progress. To McAllister, it was proof that someone in command had finally been paying attention. The numbers didn't lie. After the modifications spread, mechanical failures dropped by nearly half, while the average advance speed of American armor increased by 12 miles per hour. No new factories were built, no new materials discovered. Just a change in thinking, welded together by courage and defiance. McAllister's legacy wasn't a blueprint. It was a mindset. Don't wait for permission to make things better. He'd broken the law to make a tank move. And in doing so, he'd shown that innovation in war is rarely born from design tables. It's born from desperation, grease, and someone too stubborn to accept that's impossible. After the war, when a reporter asked him if he ever regretted going against orders, McAllister smiled and said, "If it rolls faster, I sleep fine." That was the quiet truth behind the legend. The Sherman didn't become the fastest tank in Europe because of engineers in Detroit. It became one because a single mechanic in a frozen barn decided rules were slower than survival. Sometimes victory isn't authorized. It's improvised. When the engines finally went silent and Europe exhaled, the war had left behind more than ruins. It had left lessons. Earl Mac McAllister went home without ceremony, his name buried in after-action reports and unofficial memos. He never spoke at parades, never told his story. But in every Sherman that still moved long after it should have stopped, a piece of his defiance lived on. He had proved a simple truth. Sometimes the fastest route to victory isn't written in manuals. It's welded in barns. The Army would call it innovation. McAllister called it common sense. And in the frozen chaos of the Ardennes, that common sense outran the enemy. The crippled tank he refused to abandon became a legend, not because of what it destroyed, but because it moved. He killed the engine, on purpose. The radio went dead. The propeller froze mid-spin. The German pilot behind him blinked in disbelief. No one in the middle of a dogfight turned off their engine. And yet, the P-47 Thunderbolt ahead of him wasn't falling. It was gliding. Silent. Still. Almost waiting. A second later, the Luftwaffe fighter screamed past, overshooting its target. The American plane dropped, rolled, and came up behind him. When the guns fired again, the sky lit with fire. The hunter had become the hunted. That was the day Captain Robert S. Johnson rewrote the laws of air combat. Not with speed, but with silence. To most it looked suicidal. But for him, cutting power wasn't surrender. It was control. It was 1943, somewhere over northern France. The Luftwaffe still ruled the sky. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs outclimbed, outturned, and outgunned nearly everything the Allies could field. The Americans had just arrived with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Fast in a dive, heavy in a climb, and stubborn as a mule. Johnson's squadron called it the Jug, a flying anvil that refused to die. But that day, his luck was running out. 3 Messerschmitts circled him, closing fast. His fuel gauge dipped low. His guns were empty. Then came the moment that would enter aviation legend. Johnson closed the throttle, cut ignition, and let the big radial engine die. The roar vanished. All that was left was the whisper of wind against metal, and the scream of German engines rushing past. They thought he was hit. They thought he was finished. He restarted the engine mid-fall, pulled hard, and fired. 1 German went down in flames. The others broke away, too stunned to react. When he landed back in England, the ground crew counted 21 bullet holes in his plane. None had hit the engine. Someone asked how he'd survived. Johnson simply said, "Sometimes the fastest way to win is to stop moving." That was the birth of the impossible tactic, the moment a pilot discovered that silence could outfly fear. For most pilots, speed was life. That was what they'd been taught from the first day of training. Keep the throttle open, keep climbing, never slow down. The manuals said the same thing. Altitude, airspeed, and angle of attack were sacred. Lose one, and you were dead. But the sky had started to prove the manuals wrong. By 1943, American pilots were facing veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had survived since the Battle of Britain. The Germans were masters of energy fighting, using speed to dive, strike, and climb away. Their aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190, were lighter, sharper, and far more responsive. Against them, the U.S. Army Air Force sent up the P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. It climbed slow, turned wide, and needed a mile to recover from a dive. German aces mocked it, calling it the flying milk jug. But the jug had secrets its enemies didn't understand. The P-47's massive radial engine gave it extraordinary torque stability, the ability to glide cleanly even with no power. When that engine shut down, the aircraft didn't drop like a stone. It coasted like a hawk folding its wings. And in that glide, something strange happened. The P-47 could outturn its German pursuers. It defied instinct. Pilots were taught to fight by gaining energy, not losing it. Yet Johnson's maneuver proved the paradox. In a turning fight, sometimes speed was the enemy. A Luftwaffe ace could overshoot by inches and never recover. A Thunderbolt pilot coasting in silence could pivot in that heartbeat and strike. When Johnson first described it, his peers laughed. "You can't outfight someone by stopping your engine," one pilot said. Johnson smiled. "You can if he's flying faster than he can think." The myth of speed had ruled aviation for decades. But the Thunderbolt's brute weight, its stubborn momentum, and its resilience turned that myth upside down. What mattered wasn't how fast you could fly, but how fast you could change direction. That single truth would turn the air war over Europe upside down. And every pilot who heard Johnson's story began to wonder the same thing. What if the key to surviving the Luftwaffe wasn't in pushing harder, but in knowing when to stop? Every dogfight is a math problem with no mercy. Altitude, airspeed, drag, thrust, numbers that decide who lives and who doesn't. The Luftwaffe built their entire doctrine around power and precision. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 were designed to dominate vertical energy. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. Their inline engines gave them blistering acceleration and sharp control, but at the cost of forgiveness. At the edge of stall, they snapped like glass. The Americans fought with something heavier, something that didn't make sense on paper. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Its engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800, weighed nearly 3,000 pounds, more than some entire fighter planes. But it came with an unintentional advantage: inertia. That engine was a spinning mass of pure momentum. When Johnson or any Thunderbolt pilot killed power, that inertia kept the propeller moving just long enough to stabilize the aircraft. The plane didn't drop. It coasted. It absorbed the wind like a sail instead of fighting it. This created a strange aerodynamic trick called torque bleed. With the engine off, the Thunderbolt's drag decreased just enough to allow tighter control of the rudder and a shallower turn radius. Its heavy frame resisted overbanking, allowing smoother energy transitions. In short, when the P-47 went quiet, it became graceful. German fighters, by contrast, relied on continuous thrust. When they slowed, they lost lift immediately. They needed to fly fast to stay alive. A gift and a curse. Republic Aviation's engineers didn't design the Thunderbolt for this purpose. They intended it to be a high-altitude escort, not a duelist. But in the chaos of air combat, pilots like Robert S. Johnson discovered what no wind tunnel could predict: Silence could be tactical. At low altitudes, a gliding P-47 could turn 80 feet tighter than a full-power Bf-109. At medium altitudes, the glide produced an energy lag that forced German pilots to overshoot. It wasn't a trick of luck. It was physics weaponized by instinct. And that instinct was spreading. Squadron briefings started including phrases like power bleed, silent turn, and glide stall window. None of it appeared in the manuals. It lived only in the conversations between men who had survived too many ambushes. They were rewriting the book of flight, one dead engine at a time. For the first time, American pilots were learning that dominance in the air wasn't just about horsepower. It was about timing, when to climb, when to dive, and when to disappear completely. The numbers told the story of a war that was supposed to be lost in the air, until math changed it. In 1942, the Luftwaffe owned the sky. Their kill ratio over Europe stood at 3-1 in Germany's favor. The Americans were losing men faster than they could train replacements. Pilots lasted an average of 15 missions before being shot down. Then came 1944. The ratio flipped. By summer, the U.S. Army Air Force was destroying 3 German planes for every one lost. It wasn't just production, it was adaptation. And buried inside that reversal was a simple but terrifying idea: control through deceleration. Flight engineers began plotting new engagement curves. They discovered that when a P-47 Thunderbolt cut its engine at low altitude, under 10,000 feet, its turn radius tightened from 420 feet to 340 feet. Every 10 degrees of arc gained meant 1 second less exposure to enemy fire. 1 second was life or death in a sky moving at 400 miles per hour. At full throttle, the Bf-109 could outrun the P-47 by 30 mph. But in a turning circle, speed turned into liability. The faster aircraft overshot, exposing its belly or tail. A fatal mistake. Johnson called it the math of risk. Every fighter has a heartbeat, he said. When you cut power, you can hear it. By cutting his engine for just 3 seconds, he could shift from prey to predator. The Luftwaffe pilots couldn't process the sudden deceleration. Their instincts, trained for constant motion, betrayed them. Air combat films later confirmed it. The average overshoot distance after a P-47 engine cut was 70 meters. That gap gave Johnson just enough time to roll, restart, and fire. He wasn't faster, he was less predictable. The new tactic spread quietly. Commanders didn't like it. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. But field results silenced objections. For every pilot who mastered the maneuver, survival odds jumped by 40%. It wasn't magic. It was physics meeting nerve. Luftwaffe intelligence began reporting sudden loss of targets. American planes vanishing mid-turn, then reappearing behind them. The reports used one word over and over: impossible. But impossible was exactly what men like Johnson had learned to do. One engine cut at a time. The numbers didn't just show improvement, they showed a pattern of disbelief turned into doctrine. The silence that followed an engine kill wasn't fear anymore. It was calculation. The morning of June 26, 1943, started like any other patrol. The 56th Fighter Group was escorting bombers returning from a raid over northern France. The sky was clean and blue. Too clean. Captain Robert S. Johnson had a feeling it wouldn't stay that way. He flew his P-47 Thunderbolt Lucky II just below the bomber formation. Then came the call over the radio. Bandits, 3 o'clock high. 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s dropped out of the sun, their cannons flashing. The first pass shredded a B-17's wing. The bombers scattered. The escorts broke formation. Johnson rolled to intercept, but a burst of fire tore through his fuselage. Oil splattered across his canopy. His guns jammed. His plane shuddered. He was alone. The Germans circled like vultures, waiting for the kill. Johnson's instruments were dying. Engine temperature rising, oil pressure falling. He could bail out. He didn't. Instead, he did something no sane pilot would do. He closed the throttle. The roar of the R-2800 faded. The propeller slowed until it was just a blur, then stopped. The cockpit fell into eerie silence. The only sound left was wind. He watched the lead Messerschmitt overshoot, confused. The German expected the P-47 to fall. It didn't. The heavy Thunderbolt glided smooth and steady, its nose dipping just enough to bleed altitude. The second German closed in, firing wildly. Tracers hissed past Johnson's canopy. He didn't flinch. He waited. When the Bf-109 passed him, too fast to correct, Johnson flipped the ignition back on. The big radial engine coughed once, twice, then screamed back to life. The German pilot never saw the turn coming. Johnson pulled into a high G roll, came up behind him and opened fire. The first burst hit dead center. The Messerschmitt erupted in smoke. The other two fled. Johnson limped home with holes through both wings. Half his controls shot away. When he landed in England, his crew chief counted 21 bullet holes in the fuselage, and not a single engine failure. Reporters later asked him what possessed him to shut his engine off mid-fight. He smiled. Because it was the only thing I hadn't tried yet. His commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, called him insane, until they saw the gun camera footage. The maneuver worked because it broke every expectation. The Germans relied on power. The Americans had learned to weaponize stillness. Word spread fast. Pilots in the 56th Fighter Group began whispering about Johnson's trick. Some called it the silent turn, others the dead glide. The idea was simple. Remove your own noise and let the enemy outrun your silence. By the next month, at least 5 pilots had used the maneuver in combat, each returning home alive. In the thin air over Europe, silence had become a new kind of weapon. By late 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had stopped calling the engine kill a stunt. It had become something else, a philosophy. Pilots started to think in equations instead of instincts. They called it the doctrine of energy, the belief that every second of throttle, every foot of altitude, every fraction of drag could be measured, saved, and weaponized. Before Johnson, dogfights were chaos. Throttle up, pull hard, spray bullets, hope for luck. After Johnson, every maneuver became math. Energy meant life. Waste meant death. The Germans flew by reflex. The Americans began to fly by ratio. Colonel Zemke drilled it into every new pilot. Altitude is the bank, speed is the currency, spend it wisely. And the strangest lesson of all, sometimes the smartest way to save energy was to lose it. By cutting the engine, a pilot could force a pursuer to overshoot, trading speed for position, momentum for control. A 3-second silence could flip the geometry of a fight. It defied logic, but it worked. Flight instructors began building training modules around the theory. They used chalkboards drawing curves of pursuit arcs and energy loops. The line that mattered most wasn't the fastest one. It was the one that ended behind your opponent's tail. For the Luftwaffe, this was a nightmare. Their entire doctrine depended on momentum and engine power. They couldn't adapt fast enough. The American fighters, once mocked for their weight, were now turning their mass into an advantage. Every new pilot in the 56th learned the same unspoken truth. Control wasn't about going faster. It was about knowing when to stop pushing. In the chaos of air combat, that mindset changed everything. A silent second became a weapon. A drop in throttle became a trap. The sky had become a chessboard, and Johnson had taught them how to play it in slow motion. January 1944. The 56th Fighter Group was escorting B-17s over western Germany. The air was thin, brittle, and blue. Below, the world looked peaceful, a lie only pilots could see through. Lieutenant Wayne Blickenstaff, one of Johnson's younger pilots, was flying his 3rd mission. He had heard the stories, the engine kill, the silent turn, the insane maneuver that supposedly saved Johnson's life. He didn't believe it, until that day. At 20,000 feet, a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s struck the bomber formation. The first pass tore through the escorts, scattering them. Blickenstaff broke left trying to climb, but a 190 latched onto his tail. The German pilot was good, disciplined, patient. He matched every move Blickenstaff made. The tracers crept closer. Too close, Blickenstaff muttered. His oxygen mask fogged. His pulse was thunder. He remembered Johnson's words in the mess hall weeks earlier. If he's faster, make him think you're falling. It sounded ridiculous then. Now it was all he had left. He pulled the throttle to 0. The roar vanished. The propeller slowed, then stopped. The 190 pilot saw it and hesitated. No smoke, no explosion, just silence. Blickenstaff eased the stick, feeling the heavy Thunderbolt glide into a gentle dive. The German fighter overshot, his gun still firing into empty sky. In that instant, Blickenstaff reignited the engine. The R-2800 came alive with a violent growl. He pulled into a tight climbing turn, rolled over, and dove on the 190. One burst, one kill. Jesus, he whispered, it worked. He rejoined formation minutes later, heart still pounding, fuel gauge dipping low. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio. You crazy bastard. Did you just stop your engine? Blickenstaff laughed shakily, only for a second. When they returned to base, he told the story over coffee. The room fell silent. No one mocked the idea anymore. By the next week, several pilots had begun practicing controlled power cuts during training flights. They learned the balance, how long you could glide before losing altitude, how to time the restart. One instructor wrote in his notes, "The maneuver requires nerve beyond training, but those who can master it survive." The Army never added it to the official manual, but the men did, in grease pencil on cockpit dashboards. 3 seconds of silence can save your life. That night, Blickenstaff found Johnson in the hangar checking bullet holes on his plane. I tried it, he said quietly. You were right. Johnson didn't look up. He just smiled. I'm glad you listened when the sky went quiet. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. The skies over the Ardennes were chaos. Cloud cover low, visibility worse, and the Luftwaffe throwing everything it had left into the fight. Captain Robert S. Johnson had been grounded with injuries. His replacement flight leader, Lieutenant Jim Warren, led 12 P-47s into the storm to hunt German armor columns. They never expected to meet the enemy at full strength. At 14,000 feet, the clouds broke. 20 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared above them. The ambush was instant. Tracers tore through the formation. Radio chatter dissolved into screams. Warren ordered a break. Split pairs, don't climb, dive. But the Germans had already bracketed them, diving faster than the Thunderbolts could react. 2 pilots, both rookies, panicked. One shouted, "They're on me! I can't shake them!" The other tried to pull away, full throttle, engine screaming redline. Warren saw it too late. The first pilot stalled from overcontrol. His wingtip clipped the airflow, and he spun out, disappearing into the cloud. The second cut his throttle completely, too slow, too early, and the heavy P-47 snapped into a flat spin. Neither survived. Below, the dogfight became a storm of metal. Warren remembered Johnson's old words scrawled in chalk on the squadron board. The sky rewards nerve, not panic. He took a breath and did the unthinkable. He killed the engine. The cockpit fell silent. The 190 behind him hesitated. To the German, it looked like another victim falling. Warren counted to 3. He rolled right, hard, feeling the G-forces crush his chest. The Thunderbolt arced under the enemy's line of sight, gliding like a ghost through the cloud. The German overshot. Now, Warren whispered, reigniting the engine. The propeller screamed. The power slammed him back into his seat. He came up behind the German and fired. 2 short bursts. The 190 exploded in a spiral of flame and smoke. By the end of that mission, only 7 of the 12 Thunderbolts made it home. But the survivors carried back more than combat reports. They carried proof. The maneuver worked, but only when executed with perfect nerve and timing. A second too long, and you fell out of the sky. A second too soon, and you became a target. Warren wrote in his diary that night, "The math is cruel. 3 seconds of silence can save you, or kill you twice as fast." The air doesn't forgive miscalculations. When Johnson read that entry months later, he underlined one phrase in red pencil. Physics met fear, and fear lost. Cutting the engine in a dogfight was never doctrine. It was desperation turned into art, madness wrapped in calculation. The maneuver had no name in any flight manual, no line in any training guide. But among the men who had tried it and lived, it became legend. They called it the quiet turn. Robert S. Johnson never claimed to invent it. He just understood what others were too afraid to test. That control wasn't about power. It was about surrender. In a world obsessed with speed, he'd found victory in stillness. The math was simple, but merciless. The faster you moved, the narrower your margin for error. A burst of speed gave you energy. A cut of power gave you time. And in war, time was the rarest weapon of all. By the end of 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence was filing frantic reports describing American aircraft vanishing mid-maneuver. Their analysts tried to explain it as mechanical failure, engine stalling, or pilot panic. They didn't understand that what they were witnessing wasn't breakdown. It was brilliance. A P-47 in glide mode could outturn a German fighter by nearly 20% at low altitude. It could change position faster, dive cleaner, and restart its engine within 3 seconds of ignition loss. Those numbers weren't theory. They were survival written in grease, smoke, and blood. For Johnson, the lesson was clear. Courage wasn't the act of charging forward. It was the patience to wait in silence while death flew past. When he retired, he was credited with 27 aerial victories, all while flying a plane everyone said was too slow, too heavy, too clumsy to win. The Luftwaffe never solved the paradox he created. Because you can train for speed, you can predict aggression, but you can't outfight silence. In the end, the sound that terrified the Luftwaffe wasn't the roar of engines. It was their sudden absence. Robert S. Johnson proved that even in the mechanical age, instinct could outthink technology. His P-47 wasn't faster or lighter or sleeker, but it taught every American pilot a single truth. The man who controls silence controls the sky. That lesson spread across the air war like wildfire. By 1944, Thunderbolt and Mustang pilots were calculating energy loss, throttle angles, and dive ratios the way gamblers calculate odds. They weren't chasing speed anymore, they were chasing efficiency. Every second of throttle, every pound of drag, every drop of fuel became part of the same equation, the math of survival.